Welcome back to the Discovering Commercial Real Estate podcast. Our guest today is Albert Dweck, the founder and CEO of Duke Properties and Artifex Brokerage. Albert, thanks again for coming on. I really appreciate this.
Thanks, John.
Of course. So before we get into business, could you tell us a little background on where you're from and how you got into commercial real estate?
Yeah, well, I'm from Brooklyn, New York. Born and raised there, right around Brooklyn College in that area, Middlewood, Flatbush, like that. I got into commercial real estate. Actually, my intention was to do residential real estate. I love real estate, and I thought to myself, well, what am I going to do? Where's my focus going to be? And I said, I like helping people. I like providing housing. And the people that I knew and lived around, no one was really doing residential real estate. And I said, I want to own the bills that people have to pay. I want to help people. And I don't want to worry about people's, businesses going out of business and stuff. So I said, let me start buying houses. So for those of you who, try to imagine what it's like today, when I started in my real estate career was the late 90s, early 2000s. And I was looking around Brooklyn to buy houses. And I was bidding on houses that I could have a renter in. So I was bidding like a 7 cap. And rates were at 7.
Right.
So I couldn't make any numbers work. I should have bought them all. But didn't.
But at the time, it doesn't make sense.
And I was looking for yield. I was like, why would I put my money to work without having to get yield? And I wasn't buying all cash,
Right.
So that was a time when rates were like that, 6-7%, and you couldn't make a cash flow because cap rates were there. I should have bought everything. I think someone told Warren Buffett once. I said, it was like 10 years ago. You could have bought the whole Brooklyn for $4 billion. You should have bought the whole Brooklyn.
Right.
So I should have done that too. So that's how I got into residential real estate. And then I graduated from houses to buildings pretty quickly. But that's how I started.
Awesome. Great. And what'd you do in that kind of midpoint between college and real estate and residential real estate?
Yeah. So after college, I graduated college early. And I went to NYU, and then I was in like the wholesale business where I was doing traveling and selling stuff that we made in China, all over the world, really, and selling that. And then I had a cookie business also, which crumbled actually, but no, I did that. I did some food stuff too, and at some point I just came to a point where I'm like, you know what, I sort of figured out how to do business, and it was time to invest again for myself. And I thought about what I really wanted to do, and real estate was something that I was interested in. So then what I did was I took all these classes, and I read all these books and courses, and I became a licensed real estate agent. And I was thinking, what part of real estate do I want to be involved in? And, really was residential for me.
Got it.
And that's my primary focus till today, residential real estate. I do have mixed use properties and stuff, but, always when the stores come along with the apartments. So.
Right. Got it. Okay. For your first deal, the first ever piece of real estate that you've ever acquired, how did you kind of put that deal together?
At the time, I told you I was looking for houses to buy, really, where I could rent them, And I couldn't make the numbers work in Brooklyn, so I expanded my radius to New Jersey. And at that time, I know it's hard for me to say this or even for you to believe it, but we looked in the newspaper for listings, right?
Wow,
that's where you looked. Like you would look in the Wall Street Journal and whatever local papers, that's where things were listed.
Right.
You would actually read the New York Times or the Journal or whatever paper.
Right.
So at the time was, I think, the Asbury Park Press. And there was a lady advertising basically 3 houses for sale that she owned. And she couldn't find a buyer because it was really something that someone was like an investor had to buy. It was 3 houses on one lot. So that's how I bought my first. I mean, I saw the ad in the paper. Obviously, she's putting an ad by herself for sale by owner. And I contacted her, and I had a good rapport. And funny story was that during the inspection of the property, I actually fell through the ceiling. Not fell, but made a hole through the ceiling
Oh,
of the
wow.
property
Okay.
because I was walking in the roof,
Okay.
and then I didn't step on the rafter, and then I went through that.
Wow.
I bought the building and I fixed it, but ended up doing well on that property and basically doubled my money in 9 months. And I said, "Oh, this is great, except can I do it bigger?" So I immediately was looking to scale, but that's how I started.
Got
That
it.
was the
Okay.
first. Yeah.
And at what point did you kind of start developing your strategy for how you go about acquiring and renovating and selling
So
buildings?
all along the way, you're developing. As I got better at it, there's always have to be something where, and I learned this from my early days in business. It's like it's a competitive environment, right? So you have to be better at something that someone does in execution. So you could do speed, complexity, and design. Those are the three ways really you have competitive advantages. You could be the fastest guy in the market. You could have really complex strategy, or you could have like a great design. And usually you could get 2 out of 3 of those 3 things. And I was thinking about how would I differentiate myself. I was going to be a very hands-on manager guy doing them. And what we started doing was in New Jersey doing that, and this figuring out really what was too big for the small investor to handle, and then too small for the big investor. And that was the kind of sweet spot that we were
Got it.
in, like you call them middle market properties or stuff like that. So we started buying that. That's how I did. And then grew from there. And then we became good at certain aspects of that, like where could I find value, things like that. And then, more recently, we compete in a lot of different ways, obviously, knowing the laws. We got involved in New York about a dozen years ago in New York City, got really good at knowing how to navigate a very, very complex system there. And then we do a lot with co-living today. And then I got back in the house business in New Jersey. We bought a lot of houses after the financial crisis in New Jersey, and then fixed them and renovated them and rented them, and then now sold a lot of them because they all went up in value. And then created a management business that was in service of ourselves, but at the time we needed to do because we had a lot of units. And then today it's like realizing that we have tenants, residents. Really, we try. The language is important. Residents that we work to produce communities where they're happy and can live safe and successful and healthy lives. And we try to provide that with what we're doing. And then what we realize is in New York City and in a lot of the country, there's a crisis of affordability. There's not enough housing. So we realize that people are living together to afford the rent, and we're trying to lean into that and give them what they need to do that. So that's
Got it.
really what we do a lot of.
Awesome. Okay. And could you give us an overview of the different submarkets that you have properties in, and what kind of emerging market that you're looking
So
to
we
get
call
into?
we buy property what we call the emerging markets of New York City. So we look for essentially New York City is the 5 boroughs, and there's 8.5 million people, and there's only so much land, right? And basically, New York City also has about 3 million households, and they're not making any more of New York City, right? So if you want to live in New York City, like I think there was a stat I read, half of all the kids who graduate college in the United States want to live in New York City.
Right.
That's a lot of people.
Yeah.
Right. And then you say, okay, well, where are they going to live? And then, they want to live in a cool neighborhood. And then what happened was about 10 years ago, crime went down across the country in New York City. And these areas that I was growing up, that when I was a kid, that were not safe or less safe, became more safe. And then more people came to New York to want to live here as that happened. And then people needed the housing. So and New York City, fortunately, has an inexpensive subway system and mass transit that's very easy to get around, and it's easy to get to, say, Midtown if you have working there or whatever in Manhattan, and you can be in Brooklyn, and then Brooklyn itself became a destination, and then the areas that were closest to the city became more expensive, and then so on. So, if we went further west to a point where, let's say, someone's commuting 45 minutes as a maximum to Manhattan, that's really sort of how we went out on the subway line. So, and then also when you're in those areas, like, oh, there's a cool coffee shop, there's a cool restaurant that people would go to from around other neighborhoods. And you're like, oh, wow, that's cool. A French restaurant coming from the city, opening here. Oh, a club, a thing. And then people want to just go in those neighborhoods to live all together, right? So what you had was people coming from out of town, out of New York City for work assignments or because they wanted to make it in New York, and then they'd have to afford to live together. So if they live, three people living together in Brooklyn and they're paying $3,000, it's cheaper than living in Manhattan in a one bedroom, right, for $5,000. So that's what happened. Those areas then became destinations to themselves. Bushwick, Ridgewood, Queens, as an example, was just voted by Time Out magazine as the 4th hottest neighborhood in the world.
Wow.
And we have a lot of concentration of buildings there.
Awesome.
Because it was along the subway line, and so that was something that we saw coming, and also takes patience, perseverance, resilience in those neighborhoods.
Got it. Okay. And so using the strategy of identifying emerging markets, what emerging market right now are you seeing that you're gonna pay more attention to in the next decade?
I think for us, it's more about the type of way people are living as opposed to where people are living. I think New York City continues to, as it continues to infill and people looking for affordability and increased density, it's more like we feel very strongly about co-living.
Got it.
In the future, people living together to afford the rent and making that a great experience. So we've been doing a lot with that successfully. And so I think that continues to happen. And then the areas that we're, continuing to develop, like Ridgewood, Bushwick will continue to develop, and further east. And then as those neighborhoods like East New York and stuff like that, those will eventually come around. But, Bed-Stuy we see continuing to grow, and Harlem, East Harlem, Washington Heights, the whole, and definitely South Bronx, and continuing to go as wherever the subway lines go.
Got it.
And I think then you're looking for, if and when transportation services improve, like if there's like a high speed rail line that comes from Philadelphia, that could be interesting for New York. But everyone wants to kind of be in New York, so that's what we're working through, working with, and continuing to find those areas where it makes sense. And I think there's a bunch of areas in southern Brooklyn or whatever that, where I grew up, where, it certainly makes sense for young people to live. You can get there. It's not trendy yet, but it will be. So
soon.
Those areas. Yeah.
Got it. Okay. And could you also tell the audience about Artifex Brokerage and how you kind of got inspired to start this and where the idea came from?
Yeah, sure. So I have a co-founder, and we started the company, and the idea was, this was before COVID, I would say, that small and medium-sized businesses need help finding office space, and really, if someone's looking for less than 10,000 square feet, the big brokerages don't really care.
Right.
It doesn't make sense to work on them. And these guys, and including me, we're looking for space. We're on our own. We're hunting our own space, and it's like you have to spend all the time. No one really. I mean, it's not like someone's going to really care about you.
Right.
So we found that with our new model, we can give these small and medium-sized businesses the attention they need. We know what they're looking for. We can find them great spaces, and we also use technology in a way to find out who they are, what they need, and help them really get great spaces. So give them the attention they deserve, and helping small, medium-sized businesses find space when no one cared about them. And we had the kind of setup to do that. We do. And, obviously in the pandemic that became challenging. And now with, half the offices are vacant. But I think that as people realize that there's no replacement for being in person, and now we're seeing a trend back towards offices and people needing offices, and certainly where people are wanting to be more flexible about that, rethinking their office space, they're coming to us and saying,
Right.
"Hey, I had 3,000 square feet here. What do you think?" And we're there to help them do that. So that's how we started.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Okay. And I want to know how your investment strategy overall for Duke Properties, how did that change since you started?
Yeah.
How has it evolved over time?
So I think first it was like I was less specific about my strategies about a particular business. I was looking for upside in the rents for sure, where I could add value. But then I got much more specific and specialized as I evolved. So like now we're looking for where we could add value by using co-living and our special design aspects, where we know how to unlock the value, whether it be in zoning or repositioning an asset, using our contractors and architects and experts that we hire to really outcompete the market. So we'll deliver. So what happens with us is we'll deliver a product and there are no comps for it because, we're building something better or different than what's out there. And then banks or, appraisals will come to us and say, "Oh, there are no comps." I'm like, "Yeah, there are no comps because we're doing this." And like, "Oh, so that's what we're doing now." So we're always staying one step ahead of the market. I often tell people that if you haven't been in my building with me yesterday, you don't know what we're doing next.
Got it. Okay.
So we're always innovating on that, and we're excited about that. So it became much more competitive, much more specialized. And what I'm doing today is very, we're looking to maximize and create a great experience for young professionals, really, and families in the housing space by giving them great amenities and great locations and community where they didn't have community. And what very often happens is people move to New York City and they're like, "Oh, I don't know anybody. How do I find someone?" And we help them do that. So that's one of the ways we're being competitive also. So, co-living and this whole prop tech thing was, we went through a lot with it as it emerged a few years ago. And then we're working to sort through it and stick with the guys that really know what they're doing. So that's what we do now.
Okay.
Yeah.
And are there any creative value add strategies that you're employing for rent stabilized buildings?
No, unfortunately, rent stabilized buildings are, there's not a lot to do with those these days. So, my partner and friend Stephen Ancona and I came up with an idea that we hope can help the politicians will take with us to help unlock some of the value in rent stabilization and help improve affordability for everybody. The problem is that we have pretty draconian laws now. New York State is, I think, the only one in the country that regulates vacant apartments, which is an incredible stat. So rent stabilization is tough. So we just try to survive through rent stabilization now. And it's not good for anybody, but including the tenants. But it's something that we're working to hopefully figure out a solution for. That's a long-term solution, which is what we need. People need to be able to afford where to live, and we want to provide that housing. We want to also be able to improve the housing we have. And with rent stabilization now, let's say if it's, I know there was a lot of complaints about that with like rents going up 3%, let's say for the next round, but if inflation is greater than 3%, then rents are essentially going down. Does that make
The
sense?
net is going down.
Right?
Right. Yeah.
So you have to raise rents to meet inflation. If
Match
you're
inflation.
raising rents less than inflation, you're actually reducing
Right.
the real rent. So people don't get that.
Right.
And then, of course, the insurance bills went up and every bill's going up. So you're okay, oh, how does that work? Oh, I don't know. We're capped at 3%. Maybe they should cap all the bills we increase at 3%. That would be great.
Right. Definitely.
So,
and let's say somebody watching this right now is new to real estate and they don't know the difference between a rent control building and a rent stabilized. Could you kind of explain that difference?
Sure. Rent controlled essentially got rolled into rent stabilized. Rent stabilized about 1 million apartments in New York City, rent stabilized, and then rent controlled is only about 20,000, I think. Anyway, rent control was an older iteration of rent stabilization. And there's a little bit of different rules about that, but similar rent increases on both of them. I believe rent controlled, when they become vacant, there's an opportunity to get them to be free market, but rent stabilization, no. But rent control, generally, the numbers are much lower rents. For example, we have a couple of tenants that pay $200 a month in rent in the same building where there's people paying thousands of dollars in rent in the same apartment. So it's a very good situation for those people, and that can be passed on from generation to generation for the people if they do follow the rules and live there. They can.
Right. Got it. Okay.
Yeah.
And let's say somebody watching this right now is 21, 22 years old, super excited about the business. They want to get into the business, start acquiring properties, raising capital. How would you recommend for them to get their first deal together or get into the business overall?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's important to figure out which part of the business you want to be in, whether it be an area or kind of or strategy. It's important. The real estate business is very big. There's a million parts of it. There's industrial, there's brokerage, there's land leasing, all kinds of stuff. So, you want to figure out an area. I'm an advocate of figuring out, really getting good at one thing and being an expert in that domain. And then, or an area, you can be an expert in that. You can know every building owner in a whole neighborhood and you could be the guy of the neighborhood.
Right.
That's another idea. So I say focus, specialize, learn, and then figure out what you're going to do that's different than anybody else did, faster than anyone else did, or better, right? So those are your three things you got to figure out. How am I going to do this better than someone, faster, or nicer?
Right. So it's important to get clear on your edge in the market before you kind of
your competitive advantages.
Right.
What capabilities do you have, and then how are you going to use them to differentiate yourself?
Right. Got it. Okay. Yeah. And I want to know what you look for in an ideal capital partner, an investor that you work with.
So, in an ideal capital partner, we look for someone who has usually invested before, right, and that understands that it's like a real living, breathing game, this thing. It's like and it changes every day, right? So someone who can understand that, things, what do they say? Sun Tzu, right? The famous
Art of War.
Art of War, he says, all plans only survive until first contact with the enemy, right? So it's a person that you could call up and say, listen, this happened, this on the plus side, this happened, this on the negative side, this happened. This is the reality of the situation. Understanding that there's different kinds of investors, but some of our bigger capital partners, those are the ones that we're you kind of want to have that understanding. And then there's sometimes smaller investors, accredited, whatever, but those people, mostly it has to be like, there's not liquidity in that, and you want to have people that can afford to handle changes, and it's long-term thinking, as you can see today. If you're a long-term guy, it's that's what real estate is really. What I learned, it's a long-term business.
Got it. Okay. And as far as when you vet general business partners, what's a telling sign that you shouldn't work with someone?
Well, what I learned was, from my experience, it's a marriage. And you have to do a lot of due diligence. I think there's like a thing that says, hire slowly, fire quickly.
Fire quickly, yeah.
Right. So you really should do your due diligence in checking people out. And what I learned was, if I couldn't see something about a person, I probably have friends that could.
Mm.
So, I should have, and when I've made mistakes in the past, I should have spoken to my advisors and friends and said, "Hey, what do you think of this situation?"
Mm.
And that's what as I got older, learned how to do better. It's like, when I have a problem now, I bring it to the trusted advisors, and I talk it out with them, and I said, this is what happened. What do you think? And they'll say, well, they'll give me a different perspective, because I could only see what I do.
Right.
And these guys know me well, and they could see what, how they can help me do that.
Got it.
Yeah.
Okay, awesome. And I want to know about your podcast, Ask the Landlord.
Yeah.
Why'd you get this started, and what's kind of your goal with it?
So thank you for asking that. After having been in the real estate business for so long, one thing that you realize is that everyone in the world, every person in the world on the planet transacts for housing.
Right.
Whether they're homeless or they're living in the Taj Mahal. And they have, questions, and they may not be experts, right? So they have a question about where they're living, what they're going to do, what their next move is, and they're always calling. They want to get advice, so they call me. So I have friends and family and other developers and residents that call me and say, "Oh, Al, I'm doing this, I'm doing that. What do you think? I have this thing. My lawyer, my landlord did this, I did that," and I would get these phone calls, and I'm like, you know what? There's got to be a place for me to answer these questions.
Right.
Okay, so that. And then what I also noticed was, don't you know that landlords are the worst people in the world? I mean, it's an easy question for you, right? Landlords are the worst.
Common misconception.
Right?
Yeah.
And why is that? And why is there a relationship where tenants and landlords, it's like two sides, it's like black and white?
Right.
And I'm like, why is that?
Right.
I need my residents. My residents need me. Why does it have to be an adversarial relationship? We should be all working together.
Mm.
And I said, I want to change. I want to transform. Not change. I want to transform the relationship between residents and owners, landlords and tenants. Such bad words, even. And how do I do that? Well, I want to put myself out there and say, look, I'm a landlord, and I'm here to help you.
Right.
So. We can people can watch the podcast, which is Ask the Landlord. It's available on every platform there is. And we answer questions for about 15-minute segments, and people have questions about everything, housing, and we've had some guests, and, but it's really cool.
Right.
So
Awesome.
I'm happy to help affect change in that way.
So your goal is to kind of, through helping people, shift the dynamics between landlord and tenants, and kind of improve it and make sure that they're both on the same team.
That's right.
Awesome. That's great.
Right.
That's a noble cause.
Can't we all just get along,
Absolutely, yeah. And how do you go about setting goals for yourself and for your companies?
Yeah. So for myself, it's really it's first philosophical.
Okay.
It's like philosophy. I don't know if you know this, but I'm going to give you a little bit of philosophy. Philosophy primarily deals with two things. We're going to get to the second one, but I'll say the first one. The first one is, how do you know what's real? And the second one is really, what's the meaning of life? Like,
Right.
what's the
why?
Like, why? Yeah, like, what's the good life?
Right.
So once you figure out what living a good life is for you, you're like, oh, I need this, I need that, and then you say, well, you could put numbers to it, and then then you're like, oh, okay, how many buildings do I have to manage to produce that income, or how much do I have to earn to do that? So it really comes from, I want to live a good life, take care of myself, my wife, and my kids, so that they can live a good life. And really, what we don't want to do is have, and what's a good life for us is like unwanted. We don't want to have unwanted compromises. We don't want to be with unwanted relationships and stuff. So we want to, you want to do whatever you need to do to have enough so that you could live a good life. And then, you can figure out how much that is,
Awesome.
if your kids go to private school, you live in New York City, whatever, you got to figure out, there's a lot of things to figure out.
So you start with the end in mind, and you kind of work backwards.
Yeah, you work backwards. And we do that. And then, so it's your lifestyle. It's like ambition, right? You say, okay, here's the lifestyle I want to live. Then you say, okay, well, what financial ambition do I have to live that?
Right.
And, when you're thinking about that, and then you do business, because the business is the thing you have to do the finance.
Got it.
So then when you think about the financial, it's like, well, and I'm going to say this for you and I. It's in a way it's interesting. You think about really what you're thinking about is I have to think about planning for 90 years of life. In the olden days, when Social Security was invented,
Right.
it was people only lived to 62, which is why it ran out at 62.
Right.
Now you have to figure out how to live for 30 years past retirement.
Right.
So that means you have to save
Whole new dynamic.
a whole new 30 years that you didn't have to save before. You're
Right.
like, so you have to earn what you're doing today, right? To live today. Then you say, well, when I can't work,
How do I sustain myself
I have
for 30
to
years?
live for 30 years. And it's not that you can't work. It's like you get to a point where, the infirmities of old age happen to you at 60, statistically.
Mm.
So you got to figure out how to do that. Then you're like, okay, well, how do I design my business like that? How do I design my life like that?
Right.
And then unfortunately, the numbers are very big because, you have to live, you have to eat, you have to put gas in the car. You have food, transportation, housing, and healthcare. Those are the big ones.
Right.
So when and those you can figure out how much they cost. And then you got to figure out how much it costs now and after taxes.
Right.
And how much you have to save for the future.
Right.
So that's
Plus
then
inflation.
you have to make a business that does that.
Got it.
So
Okay.
it's really hard.
Awesome. Okay. And Albert, I want to know who are your kind of role models or people that kind of taught you the business when you initially started out?
So my grandfather, my mother's father was a role model of mine for sure. He was running business and I got a lot of knowledge and wisdom from him.
Mm.
And he was an advisor for me early on. And then, family and friends that I had and I look at my professors, some of them in school, definitely I was, speaking to, and then there was some investors that were key strategic advisors for me at the time, and getting some great teachers along the way, and having doing some professional networks that I am in and was in, that where I could have friends that were very smart and accomplished, not necessarily in my business, but that I could talk to and learn from. And then there were other people in the real estate business that had more experience than I would, and that I could talk to and tell about my problems and things. But there weren't a lot of people around that were doing residential at the time,
Right.
so
Got
that's
it.
how I started.
Okay.
Yeah.
Awesome.
Yeah.
And what would you say makes a good leader or a good principal?
So, leadership, I know it gets, you're asking me in a way that's like trumping it up. But if I asked you what to define leadership, I'm gonna define it in a certain way.
Mm.
Leadership is being able to assess a situation, right? And what's a situation? A situation is a cluster of threats, which are sources of harm and likelihood of their occurring, obligations, and opportunities. Obligations are duties you fulfill to continue to have an opportunity, to make a new opportunity possible, or to avoid triggering a threat. An opportunity is a real, something real that you could use to fulfill your purposes,
Right.
your ambition, right? So a leader helps you assess the situation, like what are the threats, what are the opportunities, what are the obligations, and then being able to tell you how to deal with them. That's leadership.
Got it. So taking a calculation of what exactly is going on and what's the best path forward.
Right. You could be led by a kindergartner.
Right.
It's like, oh, how do I get to the bathroom? You're like, oh, you get to the bathroom by going there.
Right. Got
Like,
it.
where are you? You're here. The bathroom's over there. You got to go there.
Right.
But don't fall on the blocks on the
It's
way.
decision based.
Yeah.
Right.
So, it's not so. It's on the one hand, it's very simple. On the other hand, it's like, oh, I need someone to, when you think about leadership now that you asked it, you're saying, who can I get that can help me look at the situation, understand all the parts of it, and then help me deal with it.
Right.
And, so then there's knowledge. Knowledge is the capacity, the superior capacity to think and act effectively, right, in a domain. So then you go, okay, well, people are good at this real estate thing. and I'm going to follow them. Like, I don't know about, I'm not good with retail. I don't do, I have a few stores, but I don't, I'm not a retail guy. Like, I don't think that way. I think residential. So, I'm not the best guy to ask about retail.
So finding those specific leaders in that.
Right. They could be we call them domain specific knowledge.
Okay.
Right.
So, awesome. Okay, great. And what do you do outside of work to kind of keep yourself centered and to prevent burnout?
Right. Great. First of all, I spend time with my family. I have 3 now older kids. One is married, and one is out of college. One is going to college, and I spend time with my wife. I play a lot of tennis. I play tennis a couple times a week. I do workout 3 or 4 times a week on top of that. So I do that, and so that for me is tennis is social. These days I do a lot of Peloton, so that I work out. Have groups like that I work out with. So those things, I meditate every day.
Great.
Yeah.
Awesome.
Yeah, I get involved in my community. Like I do a lot of community work also. So
that's awesome. That's great. And what's your primary driving factor nowadays? What keeps you kind of hungry and sharp?
Just still living a good life. I know that I have to do that, and taking care of my family. Really, those are the things that I'm working for. I mean, I have to work. I don't have enough, and I'm still after making sure that I can live a good life. So I'm doing that.
Great. Yeah. And Albert, I have my final question to wrap this up. What advice would you give to your 23-year-old self?
To my 23-year-old self, I would say, try to think about the long term. I was more concerned, I think, with the short term. I would think in longer horizons of time. If I didn't know something, I would try to be more humble about what I didn't know. That at that age, like I get more advice, get more knowledge. Save more. Take less debt. Those things.
Awesome. Great. Yeah. Albert, thanks so much for doing this. I really appreciate it.
Thank you.
And to the audience, please go ahead and check out Albert's podcast, Ask the Landlord. It's available on Spotify and Apple Podcasts. I'll put all the links in the description below.